Hello everyone, this is part 23 of What If Naruto Was Like the Sage of Six Paths, and I hope you guys enjoy this video and to like, to subscribe, to share, and check out the playlist, to see more comment down below. Now let's start the intro.
They call me a god. They call me a god. They call me a god.
Join my membership, the perks are great. It's in the description. The next week was an interesting one for Naruto. Between spending time helping the people of Wave with their problems and medical concerns and relaxing at the temple, he and Fu spent a lot of time at Tazuna's house. Naruto finally got the opportunity to meet the elusive bridge builder and had a long and thorough conversation with the man about the example he was setting to Inari. It was enough to say that the number of sake bottles randomly strewn about the house had significantly decreased. Fu would continue to spend time with Inari, sometimes playing, sometimes training. Tsunami seemed disapproving at first, those thoughts about Inari becoming a shinobi and people running through her mind. However, seeing her son's smiling face as Fu praised him on finally learning a specific movement in her kata put her concerns somewhat at ease. She hadn't seen him this happy since Kaiser came into their lives. She only hoped that these new people that had returned their hope to them weren't taken away in a similar manner. It was the second day since the team from Konoha had arrived and Naruto was happily observing a game of shogi between Tazuna and Fu. He had never actually learned how to play the game himself but was slowly picking it up from watching the two play. After all, there were better ways of increasing one's patience in the temple without resorting to a game that was essentially war strategizing. It was actually rather remarkable what he could learn about somebody from just watching how they played the game. Fu was incredibly analytical, taking all the time she needed for each move as her eyes carefully roamed the board, planning out many moves ahead for a number of scenarios. Tazuna, on the other hand, seemed to be moving his pieces at seemingly random, only taking a few seconds to make his move. Yet there was something else in his eyes, a certain glint of challenge as he watched Fu frown over his latest move, her logical mind trying to puzzle out what kind of strategy the older man was employing when none could be seen. Check. Fu's mouth twisted into a slight smirk as she moved one of her pieces, squarely cornering Tazuna's king. Tazuna only seemed worried for a moment before a smirk of his own crossed his bearded features. Nice move, girlie. Almost a shame I have to do this. Fu immediately frowned as Tazuna moved a piece of his own, see off Fu's attack on his king and simultaneously putting her back on the defensive, at least if she wanted to keep any semblance of control over the board. But how? Her eyes narrowed as she studied the entire board again, wondering just how Tazuna had managed to pull that off without her noticing. Tazuna just chuckled with mirth as he played with one of Fu's captured pieces idly. Hey, for a shinobi you're very rigid, aren't you? Fu just continued to search the board before scowling suddenly. You cheated. It wasn't so much a question as a statement, but Tazuna shrugged in answer all the same, still flicking the pawn between his fingers. Prove it. Just like that, the game was back on in full heat, this time with Fu not only scrutinizing his board, but Tazuna as well. Naruto had to stifle a chuckle at the bridge builder's ploy. The man hadn't cheated at all, at last as far as Naruto could tell. He simply misguided her into believing that she had absolute control of the game while he moved randomly when in fact he was slowly setting up this entire scenario from the beginning. It could never be said that experience didn't count for anything, and Tazuna had experience in the bucket loads. Pretty clever trick, huh? Naruto looked up from the tea he had slowly been sipping from, courtesy of Tsunami, to see Kakashi standing next to him, his eyes lazily following the game in front of them. Don't worry, Hataki-san, Fu will work out what he is doing eventually. She's very shrewd when it comes to these things. Kakashi just nodded slowly before offering a lethargic shrug, sitting down cross-legged next to the young blonde. I guess that's to be expected from a shinobi, even one from Takagakure. Externally, Naruto seemed completely unfazed, just casually sipping from his tea. However, inside was another story. He was around a second away from simply blasting this Junin into the ground should he so much as hint at Fu being a missing nin. The masked man turned to gauge his reaction for a moment before chuckling lightly, leaning back on his hands in a carefree manner. Not even a blink. You really are a monk, aren't you? Naruto languidly finished his sip before calmly placing the cup down, turning to the Junin expectantly. I assume you worked this out with your Sharingan eye. Kakashi gave him a mock pout, or the closest approximation to one with only one eye and his mouth covered. Moo, now the surprise is ruined, although as I understand it you were the one to check me over after my cute little Jenin brought me back to the house, so I shouldn't be too surprised. I just hope you didn't take a peek under the mask. His eye crinkled up into an upwards crescent that translated to a smile, or I might have to KU. Naruto just remained impassive. The only sign he had even heard was the slight raising of one eyebrow. Kakashi simply pouted again, not really giving off the image of a supposedly powerful elite Junin. You're no fun. It's like talking to Asuma after he came back from his time with the 12 Guardian Shinobi. Naruto took another slow sip as he calmly observed the man before him. I assume you were referring to Asuma Sarutobi. Kakashi nodded once, which Naruto returned in kind. My senpai was good friends with him, a very strong and capable shinobi if his stories are anything to go by. Kakashi could only nod again. Asuma was a good friend of his after all. But no, for your information, my Sharingan had nothing to do with it. After all, her skin color is very rare outside of Tani no Kuni, and from the way she holds her kunai I can tell she is used to ones with slightly longer reach and is having to adjust for that, just like the pronged ones they use in Taki. Naruto actually looked impressed by that. It was amazing that the man could work out so much from so very little. Curious girl, makes me wonder what she's doing out wandering with a monk from the fire temple, especially since she isn't wearing a headband. Naruto's hand tensed slightly, but before he could even think of doing anything, Kakashi suddenly leaned back, stretching out his back with a comfortable sigh. Now, while I don't read the bingo books religiously, I think I would have remembered seeing her in there somewhere. Kind of hard to miss the dark skin and mint green hair. Naruto sighed internally out of relief. Of course Taki wouldn't put her in the bingo book. They couldn't let people know they had lost the Jinchuriki. It would make them seem vulnerable. Although I guess that begs the question of why you're out here, Naruto. You're a bit far from the temple, aren't you? Naruto found it strange to hear his name from this person, spoken as casually as if they had known one another for years. It was disconcerting. This is part of my pilgrimage. Kakashi nodded absently, not appearing to have even heard him at all. Naruto, unusual name that, isn't it? The blonde shrugged, sipping at his tea again. He needed to get his nerves under control before this man managed to pry something out of him. He knew exactly what would happen if they were to discover who he was, and he had no intention of returning to the village to become a shinobi. He had seen it for himself with Kiribi. He would be on lockdown, never able to leave the village save to defend it, or on highly guarded missions. Missions where he'd be at high risk for dying, and the ones in charge knew it but felt better at Jinchuriki-s than anyone else. I wouldn't know, as I'm an orphan. I imagine my parents must have loved ramen a great deal to have my name based on it. Kakashi chuckled at that as he leaned forward, checking on the progress of the game only to find Fu and Tazuna in a stalemate. You know, I knew another Naruto once, around your age too. In fact, he had your blonde hair as well. Although it was a lot shorter back then. Naruto simply raised an eyebrow from behind his tea as Kakashi looked away at the house. Of course, he was a loud-mouthed little kid who couldn't help but prank everything in sight. Also, his eyes were blue while yours are. He turned slowly, looking at Naruto expectantly while the blonde simply looked back, a lilting smile on his face as he sipped his tea. You know, Hataki-san, it almost sounds as though I'm being interrogated. The silver-haired Junin simply gave him a patented eye smile as he waved the boy off. Moo, I'm just trying to get to know you is all. Naruto simply smiled peacefully as he stood up, finishing off his tea in one last drink. Well then, it was a pleasure talking to you, Hataki-san, but if you'll excuse me, I have work to do in the village. There's a man there who has been bedridden for a week with a strange fever that is slowly turning his hair white. Kakashi just nodded, watching the blonde walk away with his one good eye. Medical ninjutsu is a rather strange thing for a monk to know, isn't it? Naruto paused mid-step as he turned to face the masked Junin again. I suppose it is, but I have been blessed with many friends on my travels as well as good senseis. Besides, isn't it more strange for a non-Uchiha to have a Sharingan? With that he turned and walked away, leaving Kakashi to frown briefly before it was masked by his usual lazy expression. He watched the shogi game for a bit but quickly grew bored. Slow-paced games that involved a lot of strategizing weren't really for him. He got up and walked into the house, passing Kiba and Sakura bickering like they normally did. It was Sasuke's turn to guard Tazuna at the bridge, so he was conspicuously absent from the room they were occupying upstairs. It could be Naruto, but I'm still not sure. The masked Junin set himself down on the bed, wincing as his still aching body protested, a thoughtful expression hidden by his mask. He has Minato-sensei's hair, but being blonde isn't really enough to go off of. He doesn't have the whisker marks, but he could always be covering those with makeup. If only I could see his eyes, or if the Hokage had simply told me where Naruto went all those years ago. Kakashi sighed heavily to himself and put his head in his hands wearily. All the Hokage had told him was that Naruto was in a safe place outside the village. Kakashi supposed that could mean the Fire Temple, but it could also mean anything else. However, when it had come time for his year to graduate in the academy and Naruto had still not returned, he had begun to grow worried for his sensei's legacy. The Hokage remained tight-lipped about it, but Kakashi could always see the hints of frustration that came every time he brought it up. He looked out of the window in the direction the young monk had gone and sighed into his mask. What if it is you, Naruto? Sakura wasn't quite sure what to say as she stood there awkwardly behind the mint-haired girl. It was the 5th day since they had arrived in Nami no Kuni, and so far it had just been boring guarding of the bridge every day in shifts. Kakashi had informed them of his suspicions that Zabuza was still alive and the masked hunter Nin was actually his accomplice. That had led to some chakra control exercises that were fairly easy for Sakura. Control came quite naturally to her even if she couldn't stay on the tree for more than a few minutes. If you are going to sit, do so. Your indecisiveness is rather distracting. Sakura jumped a little as Fuu's neutral voice suddenly pulled her out of her thoughts. The mint-haired girl was looking up at her impassively, and Sakura took the opportunity to sit down carefully, tucking her skirt underneath her so it wouldn't get too dirty from the ground. For a minute the two simply ate in silence, Sakura trying to think of what to say and Fu content to read the scroll in her hands. What are you reading? Fu suppressed an irritated sigh and simply moved the scroll so Sakura could see it better. However, the complicated diagrams and anatomical drawings on the scroll didn't make much sense to the pink-haired girl, so they lapsed back into silence again. So what is it like, traveling with a monk like Naruto-san? This time Fu actually did sigh as she slowly rolled up the scroll, storing it in her pouch before turning to look at Sakura with that same, impassive expression. What is it you really wish to say, Haruno-san? The pink-haired girl's eyes widened for a moment at the tense tone Fu spoke with. She had been getting the distinct impression that the girl didn't like her the entire time they had been staying here, but she couldn't remember what she could have done to deserve it. I wanted to know how you became so strong. Fu stared at the girl for a full 10 seconds as her eyes slowly narrowed, searching the girl's face for any hint of a trick. I do not understand what you mean. I became strong because I trained. She didn't miss the slight upturn of Sakura's nose at that. But don't you get all sweaty and grimy? Again Fu simply blinked in confusion, not entirely sure where the Konoha genin seemed to be going with this. Yes, that is generally the human body's response to intense physical exertion. Again Sakura's face twisted into one of mild disgust at the prospect. But isn't there a faster way? One that doesn't make you dirty or less good looking? Fu was quickly becoming tired of this fruitless conversation. Sakura clearly was just fishing for a way to get strength without beauty to get it, even if it was only a temporary S. Fu found such a desire to be shallow and childish, and it was only her natural restraint that prevented her from simply standing up and leaving, that, and the fact that Naruto had encouraged her to try and interact with the genin. There are no shortcuts to strength. Sakura frowned at that before glancing towards the pouch Fu had placed her scroll in. What about that medical ninjutsu? That's mostly just chakra control, right? If you can do it, then I bet I can pick it up pretty quickly. This time Fu's emotionless mask splintered slightly as her eyes narrowed dangerously. What are you implying about me? Sakura's eyes widened slightly as she realized how what she just said might have sounded. Oh no, I just meant that chakra control comes pretty naturally to me, and you're not from an actual village or anything. If possible, Fu's eyes narrowed even further as her previously steady expression turned into a mild glare, making Sakura slightly nervous. You think that a strip of cloth and metal makes you somehow superior to me? Sakura quickly brought her hands up instinctively, waving them in front of her. No, I didn't mean that. She had seen this girl fighting Sasuke, and although she knew Sasuke must have been holding back for her sake, she still seemed incredibly strong. She wasn't the type of person Sakura wanted to anger. Then what did you mean? Sakura paused for a moment, very carefully contemplating her next words, wary of the fact that Fuu's expression had once again become neutral, something that was scarier than when she seemed angry. It's just, you know, people go to hidden villages because that's what we do, we protect people because we are the good guys. There was a tense moment of silence before Fu snorted in amusement, making Sakura chuckle nervously at the sudden change in her personality. You are very, very naive. Sakura looked up at Fu, who was looking at her with an expression she couldn't place. It was like a mix of pity and contempt. Shinobi are not the good guys. Your village are not the good guys. Shinobi are nothing more than mercenaries for hire. For every protection mission there is an A, for every client you save there is another target UK, all under the order of the cage, who in turn answers to the client. Your jobs are based on the desires of the one paying for your work, and have nothing to do with the job being good or bad. Fu stood up, deciding she had enough of this conversation. Naruto could tell her all day to socialize with people, but she refused to have such an inane conversation. Are you saying Shinobi are nothing but tools? Fu paused for a moment, considering it. She had once thought that way in Taki, thought that she was nothing more than a tool, a weapon to be pointed at the enemy and let off the leash, figuratively. Of course Naruto had changed all that, showed her that she was a human beneath the layers of B on her hands. No, Shinobi are people, and like all people there are the good, the bad, and everything in between. However, as long as you follow the orders of your cage blindly, you are simply an extension of the village. Shinobi can lead happy and fulfilled lives, find love and even find family. The girl's expression darkened as she turned away, walking off to find Naruto, but never think that Shinobi are ever the good guys. She walked off on that note, leaving a gaping Sakura in her wake, her mind reeling over what she had just been told. It was a fairly normal Thursday in Nami no Kuni. There was a light fog rolling in off the coast and the streets were quiet. However, out on the bridge there was only silence. There wasn't a soul in sight as two figures stepped onto the concrete surface of the expansive crossing. The first was a large, muscled man wearing a sleeveless black vest with matching pants and bandages wrapped around the lower half of his face. However, the most remarkable thing about him was the enormous sword strapped to his back, almost as long as he was tall. The second figure was much smaller, wearing the traditional battle kimono of the Kiri Hunter Corp. He had two long sleek bangs framing his face, or would have if it wasn't covered by a white porcelain mask decorated with scarlet designs and engraved with the symbol of Kirigakure no Sato. He carried no visible weapons, but his way of movement showed training in taijutsu. The two looked around curiously, having expected to see a bridge bustling with workers, looking to make the most out of the early morning sun. I sent the workers home as soon as I felt you coming, Momoki-san. Suddenly the two figures were not alone on the bridge as another seemingly materialized from the surrounding fog. Ah, so you're the brat Haku keeps going off to sea, Naruto, right? The blonde stepped forward, a pleasant smile on his face as he nodded in the duo's direction. And you are Haku's master, Zabuza Momoki, demon of the hidden mist and member of the first generation of the Seven Swordsmen. Behind his bandages Zabuza gave a shark-like grin with his pointed teeth. Ah, it feels so good to be recognized by the youth of today. His grin faded as he pulled the enormous Sever sword, Kubakiri Baochu, from his back. Haku told me that you were no threat and I trusted him, so what's the deal? Decided to try and stop us. Naruto just shook his head, sparing a glance as Haku, who looked away as soon as he felt the blonde's gaze fall on him. No, I simply came to offer you a choice. Zabuza's eyebrow rose in curiosity as he placed the blade of his sword against the cold concrete with a resounding ring of metal. As you know, Tazuna will be here in a few minutes with the Konoha shinobi, Kakashi Hatake along with them. The swordsman grimaced at that. He was still sore from his last bout with the Sharingan user. All I'm asking you to do is turn around and walk away, leave the bridge builder be and allow this country to finally regain its legs. Zabuza stared at the young boy in front of him, standing there fearlessly before him. Is this some kind of joke, kid? Don't you know who I am? I might be a missing nin, but I still have self-respect. I don't just drop a mission halfway through. Naruto sighed, knowing that the bandaged kenjutsu expert would be a lot harder to talk to than Haku. Last I checked, missing Nin-s their forehead protectors. Zabuza just scowled again, lifting his blade up to rest it across his shoulders threateningly. There's no need for you to do this. The bloodline rebellions are over, you can go home now. Zabuza grunted as Haku turned to look at him, as expectant for his answer as Naruto was. I know, Haku told me what you told him. Naruto almost blinked in surprise at that, his shakuju jingling as he shifted his weight, his expression becoming slightly confused. Then why continue to work for a man like Gato? Zabuza grunted again, a part of him wondering why he was even talking to this kid. Every time Haku had gone out this week he always came back with another story about this brat. He was also smiling a lot recently. Even if I were to believe you, kid, and the bloodline wars really are over, who's to say I would be welcome there? Naruto wasn't sure how to answer that without revealing too much. If he started talking about key figures in the rebellion like Mei or Ao, then it would only raise more questions that he didn't have time for. Isn't it worth the chance? Zabuza went quiet for a moment before another shark-like grin spread across his face. Fine then, kid, soon as we're done with this mission I'll head on back to Kirigakura and see what's what. Naruto sighed, somehow predicting it would come to this. At the end of the day Zabuza was known as the demon of the mist for a reason. Do you not see what Gato is doing to this country? His voice had almost taken on an imploring tone, however Zabuza just shrugged, the large sword on his shoulders shifting with his weight. A client's a client and the fate of this country really isn't my concern. I've been paid to get rid of the bridge builder, so until I'm S or he is then my job isn't over. His grin turned into more of a sneer as he took a step forward, his blade swinging around to point squarely at the young blonde. So what's it going to be, kid? You going to try and stop me? Naruto sighed before taking a step back, leaning against his shakuju slightly. No. Like I promised Haku, I won't interfere with any of the fights. He looked up suddenly, his face a mask of determination and steel as the grip around his staff tightened. But Tazuna is the last hope of this country and I won't let anything happen to him. Zabuza seemed ready to respond but was set off by a loud cheer as 5 more people and 1 dog made themselves known at the end of the bridge. Yahoo! I told you I smelled them. Kakashi nodded to his excited genin as he stepped forward, his eyes scrutinizing Zabuza, Haku and finally Naruto. Good job, Kiba, you know what we planned. You and Sasuke deal with the fake hunter Nin while Sakura protects Tazuna. His eyes lingered on Naruto for a moment longer before turning to face Zabuza. I thought you were alive. Zabuza's grin returned as he once again slung his sword across his shoulders, assuming an easy stance. You can't kill a demon that easily. His sword came down, clanging noisily against the concrete with a bone-chilling sound. You may have caught me off guard before Sharingan no Kakashi, but your little mind games won't work on me a second time. Go ahead Haku, deal with the little genin, me and Kakashi have some catching up to do. As the shinobi all suddenly burst into action, Kiba and Sasuke launching themselves at Haku while Kakashi and Zabuza began to lightly clash against one another, Naruto slunk back, suddenly appearing near Tazuna and Sakura. Hey kid, you sure you should be out here? It's dangerous. Naruto didn't even look around at Tazuna, although he admired the man's bravery. With the amount of K-intent Zabuza was layering the air with, it was surprising he could still talk. No need to worry about me, Tazuna-san, I am only here to observe. He smiled brightly, taking his eyes off the ensuing battles for a moment to give the old bridge builder a cheerful grin. While I'm here you have nothing to worry about. Tazuna could only stare at the blonde that seemed completely unconcerned by the fast-paced fighting going on all along the bridge. Naruto himself was watching Kiba and Sasuke fight Haku. Zabuza and Kakashi were fairly well matched, so their fighting was mostly just quick skirmishes as one tried to find an opening in the other's defenses. The genin on the other hand were putting everything into their fight, apparently having received a great deal of speed from their training over the week that almost put them on par with Haku. That, combined with their somewhat sloppy teamwork, was beginning to put Haku on the defensive. Naruto sighed from where he was leaning against the raised section bordering the bridge. He was here to protect Tazuna, but he also didn't want anything to happen to Haku either. Suddenly there was a slight whisper of air being displaced in a shunshin and Fu was next to him, her own orange eyes carefully scouting out the battles. Tsunami and Inari are safe. Gato sent 2 thugs, but they were undisciplined and incapable of fighting a shinobi. I left a few shadow clones behind just in case. Naruto just nodded as his eyes continued to dart about with the genin's erratic movements. He was surprised at one point when Haku began using one-handed seals. He wasn't even aware that such things existed. Suddenly though, the entire tide of the battle seemed to shift as Haku erected what appeared to be a dome of mirrors made entirely of ice around Sasuke and Kiba. From the side, Naruto's eyes widened. He had thought there was something odd about Haku's chakra when he was looking at it. He couldn't place it, but it reminded him a lot of some of the people in the bloodline rebellions with Kekkei Genkai. He just hadn't realized what bloodline Haku possessed. The knowledge that he could create ice was surprising, but somehow very appropriate for the boy's personality. Looking at it now, he could see it. His chakra moved slowly through his coils, in some places almost appearing to be static, yet at the same time it was light and airy, unlike earth-natured chakra. He watched, enraptured, as the boy displayed his ability to move at incredible speeds, far surpassing what most Junin could follow, between the mirrors. Sasuke and Kiba stood little chance against the ensuing O of Senbon that practically came as a barrage from every mirror. Naruto was actually worried for a few moments, knowing the consequences if Haku were to K the genin, at least until he noticed the boy was only aiming for non-vital spots. He breathed a sigh of relief as Sasuke finally slumped to the ground, a pained grimace on his face as the mirrors collapsed into water around them. He was injured and would be sore for a while, but he was definitely alive. Unfortunately, that pleasant thought was short but the sound of birds chirping. Reikiri. Naruto looked over to spot Kakashi facing down Zabuza, his hand enshrouded by a layer of crackling white lightning chakra. It was so concentrated that it actually hurt to look at slightly for Naruto's chakra-sensitive eyes. Zabuza was held still by a group of dogs, each sinking their fangs into him at different parts of his body, immobilizing him so that Kakashi had a clean shot at him. However, Naruto wasn't the only one to notice this, and as Kakashi charged at the immobile swordsmen, the water hanging in the air between them began to crystallize. But Haku instead, having used his speed technique to intercept his Reikiri just in time. The boy smiled as B dripped from the corner of his mouth before slumping to the floor. Haku. Nobody even saw Naruto move. One moment he was calmly observing the fights and the next he was by Haku's side. A switch seemed to flick in his mind as suddenly everything around him vanished. It was just him and Haku as his hand lit up in an almost blinding green light. Instantly he was pressing against the wound, forcing his chakra into Haku in an attempt to first stop the bee. However, it seemed fruitless as copious amounts of it began to pour over his hands. Many of his arteries had been severed even if the heart itself hadn't been damaged, although Naruto could actually see it, pumping away. He could literally watch each pump of the vital organ grow progressively slower as the light started to fade from Haku's eyes. He seemed to try and speak at some point, but all that came out were half-formed gasps as flecks of bee found their way onto Naruto's clothes, not that he cared. Please Haku, just hang on. His voice was desperate now as his hands glowed with useless chakra. Finally Haku managed to turn his head towards Naruto, a small smile on his lips as he opened his mouth to speak, but all that came out was a single lingering exhale as the light finally left his eyes. Naruto froze there, staring down at the final image of Haku, uncaring of the growing pool of bee he was kneeling in. But it wasn't Haku. It was Shizuku staring up at him with those lifeless glassy eyes. Her vibrant purple hair was stained red as it fanned out beneath her, matching the stains across her kimono top. Naruto just trembled for a moment as he stared down at her limp hand, clasped in his own, a single tear welling up in his eye. No. He didn't want this to be happening again. He didn't want to see this. No. His free hand slowly curled up into a fist as chakra began to seep from his body like a beacon of light. No. His hair began to lift up from the sheer magnitude of the chakra he was emitting, a bright aura forming around his body as the outermost ring of his Rinnegan pulsed energetically. Gedu, Rinnya Tensei. There was a brief moment where the images of Shizuku and Haku overlaid for a moment in his mind before he felt faint, his vision going dark as he slumped to the side. He thought he heard somebody calling out his name, but it was all just so fuzzy. Naruto woke up to a strangely warm object lying on top of him. The weight was noticeable but not uncomfortable. His mind was slightly fuzzy and his eyelids just felt too heavy to be worth opening, so he simply shifted until the odd weight was resting in the crook of his arm. A smile slipped onto his face as he instinctually tightened his grip around it, finding its presence to be comforting. He still wasn't quite sure what was going on. Memories seemed to be shifting about strangely, slipping away when he tried to focus. There was something about a bridge, but the thought was gone as soon as he tried to catch it, slipping randomly between crackles of lightning and a bright flash of white light. He shifted his weight again, his mind briefly wondering why the weight next to him seemed to groan at that. He ignored it though, trying desperately to sort through his jumble of memories. He was Naruto, that seemed clear to him, yet at the same time it didn't seem quite right. Wasn't he the Mizukage? No wait, he defeated the Mizukage. A frown creased his brow as conflicting thoughts raged in his mind. He was Naruto Uzumaki. Just like that everything came flooding back, or at least it returned to him, Nami no Kuni, the Konoha shinobi, Haku. Just like that his eyelids didn't seem all that heavy as he suddenly shot up, his eyes snapping open. He immediately noticed he was in some kind of clearing out in the forest but he didn't know where exactly. Haku. He frantically glanced around, ignoring the pain from his eyes as the sunlight stung them like tiny knives. Wait, sunlight. He looked up, noting that somehow it seemed to be earlier in the day than he remembered, which meant he had been unconscious for a full day, or maybe more. That of course had him wondering why he had been unconscious in the first place. He only had memories of rushing over to Haku, the boy's bee on his hands and the metallic tang in the misty air. He heard a rustle from the bushes across from him and his head snapped about. However, he sighed in relief when it was Fu that emerged from the bushes, her hair damp from the bath she had obviously taken. She stared at him for a moment blankly before rushing over to him with a whistle of displaced air. One moment she was across from him, the next she was right up in his face, her orange eyes glancing about with obvious concern for him. After she had made sure he was okay, she stepped back, a relieved smile on her face. Naruto had tried to ease her concern, but for some reason he was finding it slightly difficult to speak. You're okay. He nodded wearily. It felt like his entire body was weighed down with weights. As a Jinchuriki, lacking energy was not something he was used to. A night's rest and he would always be back to his normal condition. Now though he was lethargic and everything ached, like he had the life force just drained out of his body. He tried to pull himself up to a sitting position but his arms just collapsed under his weight uselessly. Luckily Fu had already an arm around his back and was propping him up with it. What happened? His voice sounded small and hoarse, not at all like Fu knew him to be. It was disconcerting seeing somebody she had always saw as a tower of strength so helpless. I'm not sure, it might be best to ask Haku that once he wakes up. Naruto blinked in confusion, his mind was slightly fuzzy still and he still wasn't quite up to speed. Suddenly the warm object that had been pressing into his side re-entered his mind and sure enough when he looked around he saw Haku's still form, lying there next to him on the ground. Just the sight of his limp body lying there like that made his body feel heavier with grief. He had watched another friend right in front of him. Even with all his medical knowledge he had been able to do nothing. Wait, B weren't warm. Naruto's eyes narrowed slightly as he looked at the boy's body, moving the limp arm that was gently resting over his waist. B also didn't breathe yet Haku's sea was rising and falling slowly anyway, blowing little bits of dirt away from where his mouth was near the ground. Suddenly Fu's words struck and his eyes opened wide as he nearly jumped to his feet in shock. How? However, with the boy's already pale skin tone it was hardly noticeable. Fu at some point had walked over, sitting across from him on the other side of Haku and looking down at the now non-existent wound more stoically, although internally she was still just as amazed as when she had first seen it. I am not sure, she frowned as she looked down at the ground, her hands fumbling in a nervous manner Naruto had never seen from her before. Fu was a lot of things. Stoic, controlled, passive and when the situation called for it happy, in a quiet sort of way, however he had never seen her nervous like this before. Something happened on the bridge Naruto. The blonde looked up at the mint-haired girl in confusion as he suddenly realized that he had no idea what had happened after he had passed out. As if sensing his question Fu quickly nodded, looking somewhat glad that she could change the topic. While you were attempting to. She looked down at the body of Haku. She had run her own diagnosis on the boy afterwards and found he was perfectly healthy. Unnaturally so in fact. While you were healing Haku-san, the man Gato appeared on the bridge, declaring both he and Zabuza as useless. He had brought many thugs in order to KO him, obviously underestimating the strength of shinobi. Naruto just nodded, rubbing his temple to stave off a coming headache. He could tell that medically nothing was wrong with him, however he just felt so unbelievably drained. Gato seemed like the type of man who wouldn't keep to a bargain if there was a cheaper alternative. Zabuza called a truce with the Konoha shinobi before the majority of the bandits. He had mostly ignored everything as he attempted to heal Haku fruitlessly, however they had still been there. He managed to KO Gato eventually, but by that point he had sustained many injuries from both his fight with the bandits and with Hitaki. As far as I can tell he would have without the appropriate medical attention. Naruto nodded before pausing and looking up. Fu just sighed as she realized what he was wordlessly asking. I do not know what happened, I was forced to flee before then. Naruto's eyes widened in surprise at that, wondering if the Konoha shinobi had betrayed them. Once again though Fu seemed to be able to read his thoughts, making him wonder how she seemed to be able to so easily predict his questions. Naruto, something happened back there on the bridge. The girl shuddered suddenly, as if remembering something horrible. Something appeared as you were trying to heal Haku-san. Naruto at this point was confused, wondering why the normally blunt girl before him was suddenly skirting around the subject like mentioning it would bring back whatever she had seen. What was it? Fu looked up from where he had been staring at the ground again. I don't know, I could only see a faint blur where it was But whatever it was dark and trying to look at it was like trying to stare at the sun, it hurt and I instinctively wanted to look away. She shivered again at the memory of that thing that had appeared on the bridge in a burst of purple flames. Naruto's eyes suddenly widened when he remembered more of what happened on the bridge, more specifically just before he fell unconscious. Fu. The girl looked up again, still looking visibly shaken by whatever she had seen. Did I say something back on the bridge? Fu blinked before looking up in thought, doing her best to suppress the memories. In honesty she had been far too shocked to even try and remember something like that. I think you shouted something, maybe something like, Ged. Dao. Rinya Tensei. The words just came naturally to Naruto as he found himself just instinctively finishing Fu's sentence. Fu just blinked as she was off before nodding slowly. She had been distracted but that sounded about right. Is it another path? Naruto nodded slowly, a frown on his face. If that was it then this would be the sixth path, the last if the sage's moniker was anything to go on. Is that not a good thing? You healed Haku with it didn't you? Is that what it does? Naruto just kept frowning as he looked down at Haku, still sleeping peacefully on the ground. No. He placed a hand on the boy's seat just to reassure himself that the ice user really was alive. I saw Haku's, his heart stopped beating and I saw his final breath. He winced slightly as he remembered that. Luckily Fu seemed to have washed the bee off his hands at some point otherwise he would still be covered in it. Unfortunately she couldn't do much for the many stains across his robes, he would most likely have to get new ones. Fu was staring at him strangely, wondering if Naruto maybe just imagined it. After all Haku was right there, breathing steadily. Naruto, you can't mean. She trailed off, not really sure what to do if she had to finish that sentence. Naruto simply nodded, not meeting her eyes as he continued to stare at Haku, his mind reeling over the information of just what he had done. Actually, that might explain what happened to you. Naruto looked up, confusion written across his face as he caught Fu staring at him strangely, he couldn't decipher the look at all. What do you mean? Fu frowned before reaching into her pouch, withdrawing a small hand mirror which she quickly handed to the blonde. Still confused, Naruto looked at his reflection only for his eyes to widen slightly in surprise. Instead of the reflection he remembered, the one he knew he had just a few days ago, a different Naruto stared back at him with those entrancing violet eyes. The changes were slight, probably unnoticeable to most, but for Naruto he couldn't help but see them. His face had become just a little more angular and his hair had grown longer, quite a bit longer as he could now feel his spiky ponytail brushing his lower back. At the front it now hung messily over his headband, only the twin horns managing to poke up from out of the messy blonde tresses. Not only that, but for some reason he now had a single white streak running through his hair. Finally he noticed that his whisker marks had now completely vanished. All in all, minus the white streak, he looked a few months older, however to Naruto, his face was almost unrecognizable. What happened to me? Fu just took back the small mirror, she didn't have an answer for her friend, although she did have a few strange thoughts about the fact she rather liked Naruto's new look. I cannot say, although I imagine it must have to do with whatever it was you did to Haku-san. Fu bit her lip for a moment, once again making Naruto notice how strange such an action seemed for her, even if it was rather endearing. Naruto, I have heard of jutsu that can revive a person shortly after death before. Naruto somehow felt slight weight lift from his shoulders at that, although he couldn't say why. However, all of them are at the expense of the user's life. Naruto just blinked, uncertain of what to say to something like that. Supposedly he had just accomplished something unheard of, returning somebody's life at seemingly no cost to his own. No. He had to rectify that in his mind, with his change in appearance, most notably the strange white streak of hair, there had to have been some price he paid. He frowned for a moment, the mention of these supposed resurrection jutsu sending his thoughts into a whir. Direct chakra transfer would not work. While your chakra system was tied to your life was not tied to your chakra system. The only way it would work at all is if you were somehow using your own chakra as a medium to directly transfer your life energy into the deceased. So I somehow resurrect. Naruto frowned for a moment, he didn't particularly like the sound of that. He always thought of himself as a somewhat humble person and that just seemed too much for him. Too godlike, somehow revived Haku at the cost of my own life force, although apparently only some of it. Fu could only nod, it was the best theory they had right now and it fit into what she had heard about other such jutsu. Of course each of those was a closely guarded secret by their respective villages and often only known by a few people due to them most likely being kinjutsu, so it would be unlikely that they would learn any more. What do we do now? Naruto scratched his head, pleasantly finding that it was an action he could in fact do even in his weakened form. It was a bit strange to suddenly have all this hair, but he would deal with that in time. He looked around, quickly spotting his shakuju next to him and grabbed it, using it to lean on as Fu looked first at him and then Haku contemplatively. Perhaps we should ask Haku-san. Naruto turned in time to spot Haku blearily opening his eyes, looking just as weak as Naruto did. The boy did manage to at least pull himself up into a sitting position, looking around with a confusion Naruto knew all too well. After all, it must be rather strange to be one second and alive again the next. What? Haku blinked for a few moments in an attempt to clear his head. He first looked to Naruto before his eyes widened and he looked down at his sea, staring at the ragged hole in his clothing. Naruto and Fu stayed silent and allowed the boy to simply take it all in. They weren't sure what the consequences of reviving somebody were, even if it was right after the death. But I was. He suddenly tilted dangerously, only to find himself supported against Naruto, the blonde having shifted to catch Haku. It's all right, just take your time. Haku nodded slowly as he just breathed for a few minutes. Finally, when he seemed to regain his senses, he looked up, purposefully leaning off of Naruto. There was that jutsu, it went right through me, I remember the pain and you. He looked around at Naruto before frowning to himself, occasionally shaking his head as if he didn't quite believe something himself. I healed you. Haku looked up for only a moment before staring back down at his sea where he could spot no visible wound whatsoever, not even a scar. No, I was S. Naruto widened his eyes slightly at that, wondering how Haku could actually know something like that. Then again, maybe asking where the S go when they S was a bad idea. There might be some things better left unknown for the living. After a moment of silence, Haku looked up, trying to catch Fu and Naruto's eyes but found himself unable to as the pair kept avoiding his gaze. Wasn't I? After another tense moment of silence, Naruto simply nodded. He didn't want to lie to Haku about this. Even over the short time he had come to know the ice user, he had begun to see him as a friend, even if the goals had conflicted. Then it wasn't just a dream. If anything, Haku seemed somewhat elated by the news, which was odd, but Naruto didn't pry. However, as soon as his features set into a small, soft smile, they immediately became alert as his eyes frantically searched the clearing he was in. Wait, Zabuza-sama, where is he? Haku once again found that he was unable to meet Fu or Naruto's eyes as they looked away. An uneasy feeling rose in his stomach. So I failed. The three stood on the crest of a small hill that you could just about see the ocean from. Trees surrounded it on three sides, and in the distance the sun had begun its slow crawl down towards the horizon. Most prominent though was the enormous sword sticking up out of the ground just in front of a conspicuous mound of recently upturned earth. I was unable to protect Zabuza-sama. I was useless as a tool. Behind the boy, Naruto just sighed. Through his conversations with Haku, he had garnered a good idea of just how the boy saw himself. Despite his many attempts to convince the ice user otherwise, he seemed perfectly set in his ways. He was the one who gave me purpose in life, the one who saw in me the potential to have some worth, and I couldn't even give him that. Haku hung his head, unable to look at that large sword that so appropriately represented his master. What was the point of it all, becoming strong? I thought we became strong to protect our precious people, but if I couldn't even do that, then you are not a tool. Haku staggered back, clutching his stomach in pain as he looked up at the girl, shocked. Fu barely seemed to notice his surprise as she squarely fixed him with her orange eyes, blazing with some indeterminable emotion that left Haku unable to look away. You are a human, you have loyalties and people you find precious, but always remember that you did everything that you could, even giving your own life to protect the man you cared about. Zabuza's death was not your fault. If you want somebody to blame, blame Gato and then let go. Justice has been dealt. Haku just stared at the mint-haired Jinchuriki, silent for a moment as he found words escaped him. But what do I do now? Fu continued to advance forward, her eyes still burning with emotion until she was right in front of the boy. He half expected her to hit him again, and as he was lacking energy and weak from whatever Naruto did to bring him back, he didn't think he could defend against it. He was surprised then when he only felt her hand rest gently on her shoulder, more so when he felt the same thing on his other shoulder. Looking round, he saw Naruto there, giving him a warm smile. That's for you to decide, Haku. You are nobody's tool, not anymore at least. It's time for you to make your own decisions. The ice user just blinked, his brown eyes staring almost uncomprehendingly at the blonde for a few seconds. But he looked down, as if he was unsure of how to end that sentence. He turned away from the two, walking slowly over the short distance to the makeshift grave the Konoha shinobi had dug. He was glad at least that Kakashi had respected his opponent enough to do this. Many shinobi would have simply taken the head and the sword for the bounties. Then again, most still thought Kirigakure was in a state of civil war, so trying to cash in bounties there was seen as pointless. Either way, he was glad that Zabuza had at least this much after death. However, he frowned as he stared at Kubikiribauchu. Zabuza-sama would have hated this. Naruto looked on curiously as Haku walked forward, wrapping his hands around the extended handle of the E-blade. With visible effort, Haku pulled the mighty sword out of the ground before staggering back as its sheer weight caught him off guard. He had never actually held the blade before. Zabuza was more protective over it than anything else, and he felt slight awe just staring down its gleaming length. He noticed Naruto had walked up beside him and was also looking at the blade in thought, so Haku quietly clarified. He would have hated knowing that his blade was going to waste, rusting away as a pointless grave marker. The ice user sighed, the faintest hints of a melancholic smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. I believe Zabuza-sama always wanted to go down in a fight. I think it's the way all swordsmen wish to never giving up until the end. He shifted the blade in his hands, finding he was barely strong enough to keep it raised like it was. I think he also wanted to reform the swordsmen. He always talked fondly of his fellow members, even if I think most of them outwardly hated each other. At this point, Naruto was sure Haku wasn't even talking to them as much as he was talking to the sword itself. Is that what you want to do? Haku paused for a moment, his hand trailing the metal of Kubikiribauchu slowly before he stopped, a look of sadness crossing his face. No, that was always Zabuza-sama's dream. He stared at the sword for a moment, unsure of what to do with it now that he had taken it from the earth. I could never be a swordsman anyway, it is not suited to my style. Zabuza-sama always said so. He told me it was disappointing he had nobody to pass on his skills to. Haku looked down at that. It had always been a secret shame of his that he could never be the apprentice Zabuza had always wanted, just another way he had failed as a tool. What do you want to do, Haku? He looked up, once again noting that Naruto's strong hand was on his shoulder. Being that the most amount of comfort Zabuza would ever show him openly was some small praise after a spar, he found it to actually be very reassuring. I don't know. Naruto only smiled warmly. Then what is it that you enjoy doing? Haku looked down at the blade again, seemingly drawing strength from it as if it could directly channel Zabuza himself. He didn't know how to answer that. Everything he had done he did for Zabuza's sake. Tools weren't allowed hobbies, they weren't allowed comforts or enjoyments. Haku hated violence of all kinds and the thought of actually K made him feel ill, however he would have abandoned all of his beliefs had Zabuza simply given him the order. Now that he thought about it, there was only one thing he ever did that did not further his training in becoming a more efficient weapon. I like to heal. Zabuza would get injured a lot, so I had to find ways of helping his recovery. Naruto smiled at that. He remembered how he had first met the boy, with the basket of herbs under one arm. I liked doing it because it not only meant I was useful to Zabuza-sama, but I didn't have to hurt anybody. Another small smile tugged at the boy's lips. Learning how to heal while on the run from Kiri's hunter Nin was difficult, but it was worth it to help his master. That's a good start. Haku, despite himself, found he actually responded to Naruto's warm smile, the corners of his mouth inching up slightly. Haku remembered when he first met Naruto, how the boy had so easily seen what it was he had been preparing. He also recalled many of the villagers talking of him as some great healer, able to fix any injury and cure any illness. Your sensei. Haku looked around at both Naruto and Fu, assuming that because they traveled together they must have both had the same teacher. Do you think they would be willing to take on a new student? The boy watched with apprehension as a look was exchanged between the two Jinchuriki. It wasn't a particularly good look. Our sensei wasn't the most sociable person. It took a lot for us to convince her to train us even a little. Naruto looked around idly but found his eyes naturally gravitating towards Zabuza's sword. It was just too interesting not to look at. She also travels a lot. Last time it took us weeks to track her down, and back then we at least knew what country she was in. He didn't mention the fact he could literally just summon Tsunade to them at that very moment. He didn't think the woman would be all that pleased. Haku, however, seemed crestfallen. Becoming a medic seemed like a good idea. He could finally help people instead of hurting them. We could always train you. Both boys looked around at Fu, surprised at her suddenly speaking up, although almost immediately a large grin tried to force its way onto Naruto's face. That's a great idea. Haku's eyes widened a little, shocked by the ease with which these two were talking about just allowing him to accompany them. Not only that, but they would be willing to teach him how to be a medic, quite possibly the only thing he had left now that his master was I don't know what to say. Naruto's grin down into a friendly smile as he placed a warm hand on the boy's shoulder. You don't have to say anything. It's good to travel with new people, and I already know you will be a good friend. Haku just nodded slowly before looking down. He imagined that if he wasn't as socially stunted as he was, he might have cried at the affectionate gesture. As it was, he simply gave the two a small but heartfelt smile. Thank you, the both of you. Naruto just maintained his smile while Fu gave him a small nod of acknowledgement. However, Naruto seemed to get over it quickly as he looked at the large sword Haku was still struggling to hold. So what are you going to do with that? Haku blinked. After pulling it out of the ground, he hadn't thought too much about it, but suddenly the answer seemed too obvious. I wish to return it to Kirigakure. If what you say is true and the rebellion is over, then maybe they are looking to re-establish the swordsmen. This will help them do that and at the same time, hopefully accomplish Zabuza-sama's dream in some small way. Haku frowned though when he shifted the sword in his hands. He could just about lift it, but taking it all the way to Mizu no Kuni seemed like a bit of a stretch. Although I'm not sure how to do that. Naruto walked over, looking the sword over as if checking its dimensions. Once he seemed satisfied, he nodded before taking out a small scroll from a pouch underneath his robes. Not a problem. He reached for the sword, and after a moment of hesitation Haku handed it over. To his immense surprise, Naruto simply took the blade one-handed, holding it up like it was made of card instead of steel. The blonde caught the incredulous look the ice user was giving him and smiled sheepishly, rubbing the back of his head as he continued to hold the blade aloft with ease. My sensei was very strong. I picked some things up along the way. Haku just nodded dumbly. There would be time to get to know Naruto later if they really were going to travel together. A moment later and the sword was safely sealed away inside the scroll. Haku was no stranger to fuinjutsu. See, all Zabuza had a seal on his sea he could use to summon Kubikiri Bouchu back to him if it was lost or if an opponent managed to get it away from him. Once the scroll was safe in Haku's possession, Naruto looked up, still smiling warmly. All right, do you have everything? Haku nodded after a moment of thought. He always carried everything he owned anyway, a habit bred from being on the run from Hunter Nin for so long. Well then, let's go. And just like that, Haku made 2 new friends, the first real friends he had ever had. Despite the sadness over his master's death, the uncertainty he felt over this new chapter in his life, and the slight unease he still felt from simply being alive again, Haku felt oddly excited about it all. 2 figures trudged a path towards a house hidden away in the forests covering Nami no Kuni. The smaller one walked with stiff, jerky steps, her entire demeanor screamed of shock, and they appeared distracted. The taller one seemed more relaxed but had 2 medium-sized bundles slung over his shoulders. Both almost sighed in visible relief as they approached the front door to the modest, but still homely house. After the man had set down the 2 bundles in the beds upstairs, he had gratefully joined his smaller companion, collapsing into a seat at the kitchen table and just staring at the wood for a moment. Sensei. Kakashi looked up and immediately regretted it because Sakura looked terrible. Her hair was frayed and her eyes big, but she was also trembling slightly. The man could somewhat understand how the girl felt. He was a seasoned Junin and it was still unsettling. He could only imagine how bad it must have been for the still relatively fresh genin. What is it, Sakura? Kakashi sounded as tired as he felt. The fight with Zabuza was exhausting enough, but he had to pile on top of that the 20 shadow clones he had created in order to scare off the remainder of Gato's thugs. Not only that, but he had then been forced to lug his 2 male students, who were not particularly light, back to Tazuna's house due to them being knocked unconscious by the fake hunter Nin. What was that? The masked Junin just sighed wearily as he rested his elbows on the kitchen table. He wanted nothing more than to walk upstairs and just fall into a futon. I don't know, Sakura. The girl was still trembling, which just made Kakashi groan internally. Whatever it was that had been summoned to the bridge seemed to have put a deeply ingrained fear into the girl, and for good reason. Kakashi had faced many terrible and powerful K-intents over the years. He had even once sparred with the Sandaime Hokage, and the man's sheer chakra presence was enough to send most Junin running. However, a lot of that paled in comparison when he thought of that thing back on the bridge. He didn't even know what it was. But it was. She shuddered again, and Kakashi knew that he would have to get the girl evaluated when he got back to the village. It seemed she couldn't finish her sentence, so Kakashi just laid a gentle hand on her shoulder. Go upstairs and get some sleep, Sakura. You'll feel better afterwards. The girl just nodded shakily before getting up to leave. Kakashi didn't trust his own words though. He felt as though even he might have nightmares tonight. As Sakura left, the main door opened again, emitting Inari and Tsunami, obviously back from the celebrations the villagers had been having at the bridge. Luckily, all of them, armed with whatever makeshift weapons they could grab, had arrived shortly after Fu had run off with both Naruto and the fake hunter Nin, for whatever reason. Tsunami-san, could I trouble you for a moment? The woman looked up at him, a happy smile still on her face that perfectly matched the one spread across Inari's features. Of course, Kakashi-san, what is it? The Junin nodded, glad that he seemed to have himself under control. It wouldn't do for him to stutter like his cute little student. What can you tell me about Naruto? Tsunami just blinked at the question before a look of slight worry marred her features. Did something happen to Naruto-san? Kakashi just waved the woman's concerns off quickly as Inari looked between the two in confusion. No, nothing like that. Tsunami sighed in quiet relief, and Kakashi had to marvel at how much an impact the young blonde seemed to have had on the village after only a few weeks. Well then, what is it you need to know? Did you not talk with him? At this, Inari seemed to nod vigorously. To the young boy, Naruto was like an idol and could do no wrong. Yeah, what do you want to know about Naruto-Nisan? I mean, you already know he's a super cool monk and he can heal anything. Plus he has those really cool eyes, and he told me his staff was really dangerous to touch, so I bet that's really cool too. And the boy was off mid-rant as Kakashi put a hand on his shoulder, his one visible eye looking surprisingly serious for the moment. What do you mean about his eyes? That will be all for this video. Be sure to like, subscribe, share, and comment down below for more videos. Goodbye.